one thing I didn't say last time was about something about the incarnation. Now, we know this is God, being born into the world. So a traditional Thomas Aquinas understanding of it is that we would call because of the fall of man. In other words, God was in a relationship with Adam and Eve. The relationship was broken, and there needed to be something reestablished. So it's known as the felix culpa, the happy fall. So it's because of that God became man, so that he could draw man back to himself. Now, this is where there's nothing settled in the church. Okay, so this is not going against any doctrine. Franciscan understanding doesn't really follow that, and to be honest, it's one that I lean towards. So Blessed Duns Scotus, who was a Franciscan, said, "There's no way something so magnificent as the incarnation hinged on a fall of man." In other words, yes, God must have redeemed human. This is not dealing with redemption of the passion of Christ, atoning for us. We're not discussing that. We're just talking about God becoming man. And Duns Scotus said that it was always his plan. So from the beginning of all time, it was always the Trinity. And then I'll talk a little bit about that to lead into this. The understanding that God would come and then become one of us. Okay, so what does it mean within the Trinity? Well, a real simple understanding of the Trinity in terms of love would be liturgy. So what do we see in heaven? What would be a heavenly liturgy? Well, here you would have the Father who withholds nothing. He gives himself entirely to the Son. So didn't Jesus say that, right? That everything is the Father's, is mine. So you could, whatever imagination you have, picture, God, entirely emptying himself, his love, to Christ. Christ, in return, receives it without, any hesitancy. He receives it, and in total submission, returns it to his Father in love. And then the Holy Spirit is kind of the communicating this back and forth. Okay, so what happens in an earthly, well, I don't like the term earthly liturgy. What happens in a liturgy here on earth? Okay, so there's a significance for why the ministers start in the back and come forward. For instance, it isn't like they didn't know what time Mass began, right? Now, my children had the unfortunate position of having a father who's a theologian and philosopher, so on the way to church every day, are we going to church? Dad, for God's sakes, we know we're entering liturgy. Will you stop it? That type of thing. But it's important because, I know we have to use terms like what time does Mass begin. We have to know these things. But we get a sense of what's happening by the ministers entering. A lot of Protestant denominations will start, on the stage of the auditorium, right? Where it's the beginning, so they're up there, okay, and they'll begin with the prayer and a song. What's the significance to the ministers entering from the back to the front? Well, they represent us as the people of God entering into liturgy. So we need to know that we are entering into another time. Now I'm kind of building on the image of God, the Imago Dei, my understanding of relationality, okay? So what happens then is we are not just entering another time, but we're entering a heavenly liturgy. So we have instances of this, right? So we're celebrating, the Father's love, where the Son is being returned to the Father. And let's not forget the participation in the liturgy really is us participating in the sacrifice. Lord, accept the sacrifice at your hands. So it's our sacrifice with his. So all the sufferings in our life, all the anxieties, all the turmoils. This is, my mother always told me growing up when something was bad, I didn't like what happened, hand it up to Jesus. I got to tell you, I didn't know what the heck that meant. What does that mean to hand it up to Jesus? Well, what it meant is, the connection between what happens on Sunday and what happens during the week is that and this is, again, our understanding of the human person, being baptized, priest, prophet, and king, right? I'm a prophet, I can proclaim God, right? I'm a king, there's certain, dominion that I have over the world, and I am a priest. So I share in that sacrifice. Yes, it's at the hands of the priest. You are not ordained, right? But nonetheless, it's with our sacrifices. So our sacrifices which really is a pure gift it's being united to Christ. So my sacrifice, as with yours, is never perfect. It's always tainted by some ulterior motive or some inadequacy. But united with Christ, now it takes hold. So this is an understanding of us being united. So I would like, and again, this is not something the church would ever declare on, okay? But I'm trying to give you my Orthodox understanding of it. So the connection between Sunday and the week, I don't like the image that, you get filled with grace, because it gives me a bad understanding of grace. I think grace is something quantified, and I have a mason jar, and I'm at Mass and I fill it up. And then during the week, sometimes, and I know sometimes priests or homilists will give these analogies. They're doing their best to, hit different people in different modes. So we kind of it wears down through the week. And then we go back to church again, and we're filled with grace, and it helps propel us through the week. And unfortunately, in my view, that makes, liturgy a filling station. And it doesn't give me a good, solid connection between what's happening in my life with the relationship, with me and my mother and her illnesses, or my wife's illness, or my children and their mishaps, or my own despair. How do I unite this? Well, I unite it by throughout the week recognizing these will be the gifts that I bring to you. You, like with your son, you've withheld nothing. And he's returned it all to you in love, and the Holy Spirit communicated that. I, too, will bring my gifts, and I will unite them with yours at the altar. So the heavenly liturgy and the earthly liturgy meet. That's why when the priest puts his hands in the epiclesis, the epiclesis is calling down the Holy Spirit. This is really one liturgy going on. And so, the room is much more crowded than we think. So those who have passed on before us, those who are not physically present, they are there. That's a beautiful understanding of the human person. But you can't get that out of the context of Christianity. As a matter of fact, you can't get that out of the context of Catholicism and Orthodoxy across the street. They're the only ones that really hold that, right? That somehow we unite. Now, I heard once about a saint, and I don't know who it was, that they had a vision where actually all the guardian angels of all the people were bringing the gifts, and bringing them directly to the altar, and some of the angels were sad, not because their people didn't suffer or have, heartache in their life, but they refused to offer it, through bitterness or through resentment or just through ignorance. So, we're starting to try to get understanding of what does this mean to be in relation. So liturgy can be a very relational thing. And our understanding of gift then takes a little bit different of a twist. It's no longer, because a gift oftentimes, and I don't want to get over philosophical, but gift sometimes is a subtraction from us. I have $10, I'll give you a gift of 1. Now I have 9. So we tend to think that it's a loss. And in a sense, there must be a loss, but when it's united with Christ, there's no way to quantify it, because what he has done was infinite. So again, it's like we're adding a number to infinity, and there's no way there that it really can take away, but we get all of his benefits from it, all right? So that's liturgy. So the understanding then with God becoming man, whichever way you want to hold it, whether it's because of the fall of man, and God became man for that purpose, or that it was always an extension of God's creation. So this is why Franciscan spirituality is very Christological, right? It's all based on Christ, and it's very incarnational. So Christmas is a big deal, for them, because this is when he came for what? To reveal who we really are. Isn't that what it says? God came to reveal to man to himself. So this is how we understand who we are. Now, you already should be starting to think in your minds the difference between mystery and problem, right? This is not easy. We have to, if my wife were to say, well, tell me how you love me. I mean, you would start with explanations, and you would start using analogies, and you would start using examples, and you would start saying, well, if this, why? Because you can't quantify something like that. We tend to, when we get into, we have difficulty articulating very profound things in our lives, and may it always be like that, because this is really something that goes beyond, a problem. So I think Gabriel Marcel had a good place to start there, that if we don't know what mystery is, we know that we're getting into it when we have problems articulating it, which is why when we love people, oftentimes we resort to poems, sayings, and songs, and artwork, because we hope some way this expresses things that my words cannot express. So anyway, that's kind of the beauty of the human person. But then you see, you can't just accept that we are neurological beings. Like our brains are not our minds, right? So the Catholic understanding is the brain is the organ, but the mind, is something, it's a spiritual component within us. It's part of the faculties of our soul. And the fact that I'm an incarnate being, means something to me. So my body is not just an extension of my mind, but this is the whole me. I look in the mirror, I see Steve. In other words, now we know this by little goofy things, right? So if we were in pain, I wouldn't say my finger is only in pain, because I myself am experiencing the pain, right? We also know that we're immaterial beings by the sense that don't we have psychosomatic issues, despair and sickness and grief affects us quite deeply, right? So there's a real deep connection. And it's not going to be entirely explained, as beautiful as science is, it's not going to be entirely explained by which parts of the brain light up during, some sort of scan. That's great knowledge to have, and it's going to give us a depth of understanding of the human person, but it doesn't explain it, because we can't explain it. So we tend to look at images, and we tend to have these memories and these experiences that in the end are really the things we hold on to. So it's kind of beautiful like that in many ways. Let me see. And before I just mention something about man and woman as human persons, the entire Old Testament is really nothing more than an unfolding of God's love for us. So, you've heard the word proto-evangelium. Anybody know what that means? You know what that means? I know. First good news. Very good. Absolutely. So what happens is, it's hard for us to really get how extravagant this is. So in essence, any sin against God and an infinite God is an infinite sin. That's hard for us to understand, right? We know God, we know Adam and Eve didn't eat an apple, so let's not get into what did they eat. But I tell the students, if you want to understand, sins against God, you have to understand who He is. So if I saw two students, punching each other, I would stop that, and they'd probably get written up and maybe a day in school suspension, right? Why? Because they are equal in, how do you want to say, not in dignity, they're equal in authority. Let's use that word. There's a better word that might come to me. Now, if a student punches me, the whole thing changes, right? Now they're definitely going to be out of school suspension, but it could be expelled, right? Now I'm no better than any student, equal in dignity, but my authority is much greater, and that has to be respected, okay? Now, if you go out and punch a cop in the mouth, you're going to wish that you just had a couple of days out of school, right? So the whole thing changes. Why? A policeman is no greater in dignity than me, but he's higher in authority, okay? Now, if you're going to be one of those nuts that tries to jump over the White House wall and make a 100-yard dash, if you don't get shot, you're going to wish that you just punched a cop in the mouth, because now you're in big trouble, okay? President Obama is no greater in dignity than a policeman, than me, or a student, but he's that much difference in authority and in respect. So an offense against the president is greater than an offense against a policeman. An offense against a policeman is greater than an offense against me, and an offense against a student. You get the hierarchy. Okay, so now you go to infinite. Any offense against God, requires an infinite punishment. So all of a sudden, whatever we see that Adam and Eve did, it's oftentimes easier for us to understand in terms of adultery, only because an adultery has a sense of, breaching a covenant. That's what they did. So as the minute that this happened, what were the first words out of God's mouth? This was the first good news. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. You will strike at her heel, and she will crush your head. It was at that moment that he said, I'm going to fix this between me and you. Okay, now let's not forget. See, the thing about theology, sometimes you got to balance a lot of plates on a stick in your head so you can keep getting all the juices out of this. Remember the differences in the two creation myths, right? There's no way in their creation myth that story would ever be possible. What you just did, you were a slave, you just went against the king, it's just death. And the story. That Babylonian king will never say, I am going to heal this between me and you. And I told the kids, I said, okay, so you're dating somebody for 6-7 months. and you find out they just cheated on you last Friday night. Are the first words out of your mouth, I'm going to fix this between us? No, because that's the depth of love. So then all the covenants are really an unfolding of his love, a mystery, an unfolding of the mystery, right? You can start back, with Noah and work your way, let's work your way through Abraham and then Moses, and then you get to David, and then you start hearing the prophets. And then after the prophets, what do you start seeing? Wisdom literature. I mean, isn't it interesting? Now you're starting to hear love poems. It's almost like he's preparing the bride. I'm coming. So now you read Song of Psalms and such, and it's erotic, and it should be, because he's wooing his people like a lover. And then there's a little bit of silence there, right? And then this man is born. So, I mean, the idea of the light coming into the world and the light overcoming darkness, this has significance for us. And it should, I feel better just saying it. We should feel better thinking this more often. So our worth is never in our functions. Our worth is never in somebody else's evaluation of who we are. Our worth is always in, what did John Paul II say? You're never, how did he say it? You are never a sum of your failures and your shortcomings. You're the sum of the Father's love for you. That's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. So that then, and we can't get out of our human condition, right? Because we're mortal and such, which, by the way, death is a uniquely human thing. We deal with it like no other animal. So we can say, yes, we're animals. That's fine, as long as we know that there's a distinction amongst us. So these things then have meaning. If life has meaning, which is one of the propositions that most of the world may not accept, but we start out by saying life has meaning. And then suffering is part of life. Nobody will deny that. Well, then a perfect syllogism would be then suffering has meaning. And the meaning is that we're uniting to him. That's the paradox for the Christian person. You're telling me that suffering has meaning? Well, I think I could do with a little less suffering. It sounds very peculiar to somebody who's outside of the Catholic Orthodox faith to repeat what Mother Teresa said, that suffering and despair are kisses of him on the cross. Really? Stop kissing me, right? That's what we would say. Because we're not masochists. We don't go out, we're not cynics. Well, then go out and look for it. We don't go out and look for it. But when it comes to us, we unite it with him. So we all know stories of people who have had lives tougher than others. And is it because they just have bad luck? Or is it, and I know it sounds so terrible, or is it that Christ can entrust himself more to those people? And then we always say, don't trust him so much, right? So then that gets united with Christ, and then all he's saying now is, this is what I want for you. I want you to be in relation with me through liturgy, an extension of my love, and this is how you understand who you are as a human person. So this whole relation of the Father and the Son loving each other and returning it, right? This is why we have a Trinitarian analogies of marriage, right? The husband loves himself to the wife, he offers himself entirely. The woman in total submission receives it, but submission like Christ submitted, so it's not like a submission, I'll do whatever you say. It's, I'll do this in return into love with you. So, if we break, the sign gets you somewhere. And if you start turning the signs around, you're not going to get to where you're going. So if we start destroying the sign of marriage, see, the thing of it is, this is really going off the, ranch a little bit, but the temptation in the desert, didn't Satan try to get Christ with power, prestige, and fame and such? What is he trying to do? He's trying to break up the Trinity. Kneel to me. In other words, I want to get between your love. He couldn't do it. Offers him the world, offers him whatever, couldn't do it. So Satan resigned himself to the fact, that game's over. Christ went through his passion, death, and resurrection. There's nothing else there for me to win. So if I can't destroy the relationship, I'll destroy the sign that points to that relationship. I'll get people so confused that they will no longer know. And it's not just within marriage. We know how we can be signs and gift and relational outside of marriage. So we have plenty of opportunity for that. So if I can destroy that notion to everybody else, if I can get them convinced that they're not contingent on God, if I can get them convinced that they're, independent, if I can get them convinced that they should just go with their natures, if I can get them convinced that they're, separate beings, inside is really what counts, if I can get them, down the line, that they're not oriented towards supernatural nature, victory, And oftentimes we make it easy, right? I mean, half the time, it doesn't take too much for me to sin. I know when I do something stupid, he's over there hitting that easy button from Staples. You know, that was easy, because it doesn't take too much for us, because we forget our own dignity, okay? I'm talking too much. What do you guys think? Any questions, impressions, anything you want to share? I mean, I have something else I could say, but I'd rather get into a discussion if it's possible. Anything about those questions? I forget what they were. Let's look. What do you think if somebody were to say, God's so far above human nature, and he's so far above our reasoning, he can hardly be known? If he can hardly be known, and you're saying we're like him, then how can I know myself? You might want to start thinking in what ways has God revealed himself. How do you think you might answer that?
The Bible.
Scripture's one way, right? It's certainly one way. We have certain revelation. It's not always the easiest to understand exactly what's said, right? Even Albert Einstein, he wasn't like a deep religious person, but smart guy. Somebody asked him once, "You're so smart, can you please explain to me the parts of the Bible that are hard to understand?" And he said, "I'd be more worried about the parts in the Bible that are easy to understand." Because it's pretty clear sometimes, what he asked of us. So Scripture's one of them, right? What else? What other ways might we start to know?
Creation.
Yeah, I'm thinking creation.
We do this in fourth grade.
Oh, you did this in fourth grade?
Yeah, he's revealed through the Bible, through creation, through Jesus' Son.
Yeah, that's very good.
Or 2 of our chapters.
I'm glad you're doing that with them. Well, because it's so true. I mean, it's funny, like when people, we live in an age now where many people can convince themselves that they're spiritual but not religious, right? Now that's possible in certain faiths. It's impossible in Christianity. Because Christianity is a revealed religion. So you can't be spiritual apart from a body. It doesn't work like that, right? But so where do they find solace? Oftentimes in nature. Well, they're just tapping into what we already see, right? So, you see things. Why is it that we stare at pictures of waterfalls? I do. To me, there's something always there to see. They're beautiful. Why is that? And it's not that we're imposing, some beauty on it, but it's that we recognize beauty in it, which is philosophically one of the ways. Well, it's pretty much how we know everything, through beauty, truth, and goodness. It's like they call it epistemological ladder. What else, though? How about, well, let me say it this way. Let's do this, maybe let's be a little bit different. In what ways could you prove then, say, to a person, forget about just being an atheist, somebody who's skeptical on the Catholic faith, somebody who no longer says, I don't really need the church. I can love God in my own way. I can love God at home. I don't need to go to, how about this one? Man-made religion. God-made, how is it? God made love, a man made religion. These things sound convincing when they first come off their lips. You might want to start, if I don't mind interjecting and maybe helping you along, is start understanding how these are going to give you competing understandings of the human person. We all know this, and we all know with raising children even, that no opinion comes, on its own. It always is built on something else. Right? So when my daughters said that they wanted to wear whatever they wanted to church, they were looking to be emancipated, and they were having a misunderstanding that these were rules imposed on to them and not something that were genuine to their nature. So maybe we can make an argument, I just thought of this, although it's not original, that we think very highly of people who help us with nutrition and exercise, right? So even if we're not the best at following these rules, we know that it's good to limit refined sugar and be sensible with the carbohydrates and the fats and eat all things in moderation. If somebody were to tell you, well, you really need to cut down on say, the amount of alcohol you're drinking. Well, I don't want your rules. You would probably say, well, that's an odd way to look at your health. These are things that are good for you. They're not rules per se. We'd have to find a way to bring that into our faith, because the 10 Commandments to most people are rules until you find how they line up with you as the human person. Going to Mass sounds like a rule until you realize that it's an expression of a relationship. In other words, we would never in a million years, I could always see me tell my wife, Tina, I told you I loved you when we first got married. If anything changes, I'll let you know. That would never work, right?
No.
No, because why? Because it would be evident that there's something missing there along the way. Or, I tell the kids, why don't you tell your girlfriend? I know you got to text them as soon as class is over and you're running to see them in between classes. Just tell them that if you don't see them for the next 3 or 4 weeks, that doesn't mean that you don't love them. It's just that you're thinking of them on your own. And see how far that goes, So, I think maybe we don't get this relational aspect of us as human persons and then realize that it's an attribute of God. And that God, in the same way, wants to draw us into a relationship. And somehow, it's hard for us, right? Because we don't see God. We see our wives and our spouses, we see the girlfriends and the boyfriends, but we don't see God, so then that gets us a little screwed up. And then... And this is the kicker, is that, and this is where we need to see the image of God in other people. And then all of a sudden, we're stuck again, which is why the Sermon on the Mount is such a beautiful thing. He's never going to ask us what our positions were, how much money we had, how many years we taught, how many kids we had, how big our house was, but it was, when somebody was hungry, did you feed them? When they were thirsty, did you give them drink? When they were hungry, so on and so on. These are the marks of our lives. So, in that way, I think we should be living counter to our cultures. And that's where I think I sacrifice. And I don't think I do a half-bad job. I just don't think it's radical enough. Anything? I'm not doing a very good job of starting a conversation.
Well, one of the things it says is, how would you respond? It's got so far about human nature and human reason, but he cannot be known. But it is through reason, but not reason alone, that it has to be the first step.
Yeah.
Because God does reveal himself first through the intellect and the awareness, and if you use some of the Socratic method of unreeling it by one question, you can't get perfectly, you can't make the leap, because Kierkegaard says you have to make that leap of faith. Yeah. But reason can take you, I think the church, through its reason, through its intellect, and through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, leads one to reach an aha moment, and then you can make the leap. So you have people pushing you sometimes.
That is interesting. You said about the aha moment. I started out teaching the students cryptograms and the eureka phenomenon, because I tell them, this process is like everything else. Certain things start to sink in, and it can take time, and then all of a sudden it clicks. And at that moment, you understand things on a different level. And that's a beautiful moment. The problem is once you reach that moment, you can never go back. You just can't go back. You can't intellectually unlearn something that's known that. And I said, the love of another person is like that. Once you've experienced the love of the other person, no matter how bad they hurt you, you realize what that moment was. And you can't unlearn it. So that moment then becomes significant for you. And it presents a reality to you that whether you're experiencing it now, you realize it's possible. So once you get to that moment, and like he said, you're doing this like this dialectic exercise, right, with your own mind. So reason is important. This catechism teaches that we can come to know God by reason, but that's not the extent of it. But it's significant that Socrates. I don't know if do you know why he was put to death? Do you know what his charges were? Do you remember?
Because of his beliefs on theology, his beliefs on religion.
Well, yeah, and precisely that he was corrupting the youth because
teaching them.
He lived in a pluralistic, system of gods, and he, through reason alone, deduced there cannot be that many gods. There can only be one God. So he, according to their school, was an atheist. So he was put to death for corruption of the youth, for spreading that type of message. So that's how far somebody can go, and Dante, I know Dante Alighieri's book, The Comedy, isn't scripture, but he did put those people in, and there's no limbo, but he put them in the first level of hell, the benign people who just never had baptism, but nonetheless probably went as far as you can with the light of reason. And John Paul II puts this right in his encyclical Fides Oratio.
Fides Oratio.
Yeah, that these like they're not equal, right? But he calls them two wings, and they're both necessary. So what reason does for us is, if we had reason alone, it would disorient it. Faith is really like the act is a rudder for each. Reason would kind of like go off on its own. If we had faith alone, we would be, fetus. In other words, we would be like some of the fundamentalists that we would see. So our faith doesn't have to be perfectly rational, but there's a certain part of it that can be explained. Now, that being said, I'll give you a real interesting story. A friend of mine who was an Orthodox Jew, who from New York, grew up in Brooklyn, he was considering becoming Christian. He just didn't know if he wanted to become Orthodox or Roman Catholic. He became neither, as far as I understand, in the end. But it was interesting, his observation. He said, I'm leaning towards the Catholics because you guys try to explain stuff. I go to the Orthodox and everything's a mystery. Now, in their defense, there's good on both parts. In our, sometimes we explain things so much that, we get away from it's okay to have mystery. I mean, in other words, we don't have to just look good in front of elite intellectuals. That's not our goal in life. At some point, it's enough that I know my wife loves me. My experience and the depth of my heart knows that. Whether I can validate that to somebody else at some point isn't necessary. And that's true for God too. We just don't want to go the other direction that says, none of that matters. We can't forget that we're rational beings too. So that's very good. Anybody else have anything? I'm going to have to venture into the female-male thing. But the reason why I want to do this is because I'm really interested in your feedback, all right? Because maybe you can say, well, I don't agree, and you might be right. I mean, so the list I'm giving you is my list, all right? It actually came from one of the courses I had with a philosophical anthropologist too, and she was a woman, and she said, I like your list, but I'm more of a man according to your list than I am a woman, which is important to note that we're not, you have to watch stereotypes, right? When we can't set these in stone, because none of us are, we all have certain traits that might be more feminine or more masculine. That's not the point, right? But we live in a world where we don't recognize sex anymore. And sex, by the way, is male-female. Gender is masculine and feminine, right? So a male sex can have, a feminine approach. That doesn't make him female. So if you want to be a stickler like I do, because I'm part smart aleck, if I'm ever filling out a form and it says gender, I cross it out and put sex, male, because in my view, that's what sex is. Gender is masculine. But anyway, this list, again, I don't want to make more of it than this. But let me hear what you have to think. The contrast of male and female. I would say the female is much more personal and relationship oriented, and the man is much more practical and logical oriented. Me and my wife play these out. Maybe that's where I got it from. She's much more personal. I'll add something. She's immanent. She's in the moment. I'm very transcendent. I'm always over there. I think women are more, they're more relational in the sense that personal relationship is much more important as a value of who they are than I think a man might be more vocational. Now, again, I'm not trying to be strict with this, right? But let me go down the list and then see what you say. So I say the female is more personal relationship, the male practical and logical. The female is much more relational and nurturing. The male is more individual and apart. The female looks for her identity through other relationships. The male looks for his identity through vocation. The female is much more immanent and looks to immediate consequences. The male is much more transcendent and sees his growth through change. The woman, this is really not one that we could argue. Her fertility is very bodily, so it's interior to her, and for the male, it's outside of us. So we have a different understanding of fertility. Woman is much more stimulated by touch, typically. A man, much more stimulated by sight. Female, they can have multi-level relationships. Men are pretty one-dimensional. You know, this is it. Women, much more intuitive, and I think male are much more skill-oriented. Now, it's interesting. I had a cousin who died at 50 years old from cancer, and his son was had just finished with a master's degree. No, he had a law degree and an MBA, double major, graduate degree from Duquesne. And his stepfather was dying, and here we were in hospice, right? And his mother was there, and us too. And how we got talking about this is beyond me. But we did. So we started talking all this stuff, and his perspective was that I was just being, stereotypical, and that I was just laying this out there and making categories that don't exist, and you got to stop that. And we argued back and forth, calmly. And then I looked over and I saw his mother had never left the side of her husband and was holding his hand the whole time. And I said, can I ask you something? Do you think if there were two women in this room having an argument, that they would have been doing what we were doing just now? Do you guys think that? I mean, because this is just an experience. I'm not right or wrong on this. Or do you think they would have been involved in that situation? Do you see how my interpretation of it was is that I was transcendent from that? The woman was very imminent. I was more interested in the logical argument. The woman was more interested in the relation going on. It's been my experience with my wife. I don't know. Do they sound more like, do you see any discrepancies in what I'm saying? Anything you could help me improve them? What do you think?
I'm beginning to understand why my friends, I'm going to say, oh, well, that's a guy thing.
Yeah.
And
Well,
there is a difference. You can tell when they're babies.
It's true. There was a study, and when I do this with the students, I have all the materials. I'm very research oriented, so I don't like saying anything unless I can show them. They had, I think, 1-year-olds, and they did a sociological experiment where they put the 1-year-olds behind a baby gate, and then they had the moms go sit like in the other room where they can see them, and the young girls stood at the gate and cried the entire time until the mother finally came. And then they did the same thing with the boys. The boys managed to knock that screen down and find a way to get over there. I mean, they were different, and they weren't crying. They weren't crying. They just thought, how can I solve and get through this? There's a real play now. I read a lot in human sexuality and feminism and such, and there's a real play now that a lot of what we call it the feminists today think they got shortchanged by the Gloria Steinem. In other words, you weren't trying. You were trying to emasculate us. No, I'm sorry. You were trying to masculinize us. In other words, you were seeing the male. I'm not saying I said this, but they were making these observations that through the 70s and the 80s, they were seeing the male as the goal. So we want to be more like that. And these feminists that I'm reading now, to be quite frank, they're not in line with the church. They're atheists. To be honest, what I'm thinking of is a lesbian activist who says, my goal is not to be male. So what is feminine must be celebrated within me. And that's a little bit different than the feminism 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So it's hard to say if they're not recognizing that there's a unique femininity and that should be celebrated in itself. I don't know, what do you think?
I'm having a thought here, and correct me if I'm really off the rails here.
Well, you don't be farther off than me.
When you take a look at and it's all about relationships. And I'm going to go back to creation. And this is my thinking on this, the difference between the sexes and why the traits are different. You have the Trinity, and the Trinity is a relationship and unity in one.
Yeah.
You have the creation of Adam first. Adam had both, and we all know that every male and woman has both a male component and a female component. And in the male, the testosterone, the chemical is more significant than in the female.
So we all start off female, and then the testosterone makes male.
So right. Adam was equal parts, and it was not good for the man to be alone. So the creation of the female was to differentiate those differences so that they could have a relationship closer in the image and likeness of God in a relationship of unity. But apart, they're just individual and alone, and that's why the variances. Now, does that mean some women can't be more masculine than and men can't be more feminine, there can be disorders and all that. But that's the kind of way I'm playing that historical.
Well, that's an interesting, I never thought about it, it's a pretty interesting insight, I have to think about that, you know. It just shows that, you know, like I think it was Bishop Fulton Sheen once said that if a priest doesn't have a very intimate relationship with Mary, then he becomes almost like a savage or a bully. In other words, there's nothing there to counter the masculinity in that. And again, these things, how hard and true they are in every circumstance, well, you don't know. I mean, there's generalizations, but generalizations are based on some sort of observations that we have. And it's true, at least in my marriage. We can, if somebody comes to my house with issues or whatever, my wife is as empathetic as she's involved in that. You know, I'm always solving the problem, which I hear. I mean, it's a joke. So when you hear these jokes so often, you think there's got to be some basis to it, right? It took me forever when I came home and my wife was explaining something that happened down at the shop or with her day, that she wasn't asking me, what do I do? I mean, that's all I was hearing. You must be telling me this because you'd like me to help you solve this. But that wasn't what her goal was. It's just, this was my day, share in it. I don't think guys would be the first to step in and think that, Now, some people are very good at it, but I think for me, it was something that I learned, which is the glory of marriage, right? You learn this thing going both ways. The only reason I'm bringing up today is because, let's go back to our creation story. He created them male and female. That's under attack, and there's something to be lost. So I see certain, I don't know what you'd call them, neo-feminists today, that are recognizing there was something wrong with the way it was done before. That yes, there needed to be liberation. We're not talking about equal pay status and stuff, but the understanding of the female couldn't just be compared to the male. That wasn't fair to say, well, we want what he has. That somehow there's something there in itself, and to be quite honest, it's probably the better of the two. Children will go to their mother, not always, but typically to the mother first. Even my grandkids, I'm like, for someone not to cry with my grandkids, I walk in my daughter's house, my 5-year-old granddaughter said the other day, Pop, what are you doing here? Until she saw my wife. Grandma! And then she comes running over. Now, I don't know how I can generate that. I don't know. But nonetheless, the bottom line is there's male and female. All these things are just constructs. Yeah, this is my own list, but it's not my own list. These are, bits and pieces of things that have been taken from over the years. But anyway, anything? Honey? We at least got through something, a little bit of understanding what does it mean to be made in the image of God, how that stems from the relational aspects within the Trinity, even how the liturgy plays into that, and how this is going to have ramifications in everything that we do. It's how we see the world, it's our outlook. So, whether we see the world and other people in utilitarian fashions, whether we see them as they're determined, whether we see them as we would say, in the wholeness of the Catholic understanding of the faith. All right? Okay. It's good enough. 10 minutes early is good, right?
Good.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.
See you on Monday.